The girl revealed to the millionaire in tears, "I know what they did to your daughter. He is in shock." Before we embark on this story, write down where you're watching from in the comments. Let's go. The room was silent except for the rhythmic ticking of the antique grandfather clock that stood in the corner. Ethan Calder sat at his mahogany desk, his once proud shoulders now slumped under the weight of years of unanswered questions and unrelenting grief. The dim light from a single lamp cast long shadows across the walls of his opulent study. But even the finest furnishings couldn't mask the emptiness that had consumed him since that fateful day 5 years ago. Ethan stared at the photograph in his trembling hands, a picture of his daughter, Lila Calder, smiling brightly against the backdrop of their sprawling estate. She had been only 10 when she vanished without a trace, leaving behind nothing but a void that no amount of money or power could fill. Every night, Ethan replayed the events leading up to her disappearance, searching for clues he might have missed. But no matter how hard he tried, the truth remained elusive, buried beneath layers of unanswered questions and broken promises. His mansion, perched atop a hill overlooking the city, was more prison than home these days. The grand halls echoed with memories of laughter and joy that now felt like cruel taunts. He avoided the rooms Lila used to play in, unable to face the ghosts of her presence. Instead, he spent most of his time here, in this study, surrounded by documents, newspaper clippings, and photographs, all remnants of a desperate man clinging to hope. Tonight, however, something was different. As the clock struck midnight, the sharp ring of the doorbell shattered the silence. Ethan froze, his heart pounding in his chest. Who could be visiting at this hour? With hesitant steps, he made his way to the entrance, each footfall echoing ominously through the cavernous house. When he opened the door, he found a young girl standing there, her small frame wrapped tightly in a threadbare coat. Her wide eyes were filled with both fear and determination as she looked up at him. For a moment, they simply stared at one another, the cold wind swirling around them. "I know what they did to your daughter," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the howling breeze. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. His mind raced, trying to process her words. "Who are you?" he managed to choke out, his voice hoarse with emotion. "My name is Sophie Parker," she replied, clutching a tattered backpack to her chest. "And I can help you find her." Ethan's knees nearly buckled beneath him. Could this child truly hold the answers he'd been searching for all these years? Or was she just another cruel twist of fate, sent to torment him further? "Come inside," he said finally, stepping aside to let her in. As Sophie crossed the threshold, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that his life, and perhaps his daughter's fate, was about to change forever. Ethan led Sophie into the warmth of the study, his mind reeling with questions. Who was this girl, and how could she possibly know anything about Lila? He gestured for her to sit in one of the leather armchairs, then poured himself a glass of whiskey, his hands still shaking. He didn't offer her anything. Instead, he studied her closely, searching for any sign of deception. Sophie seemed unfazed by his scrutiny. She set her backpack on the floor and folded her hands neatly in her lap, her expression calm despite the gravity of the situation. Ethan took a deep breath, trying to steady himself before speaking. "How do you know about my daughter?" he asked, his voice low but firm. Sophie hesitated, as if choosing her words carefully. "I've seen her," she said finally. "In a place, a bad place." Ethan's grip tightened on the glass. "Where?" "It's called an orphanage," Sophie began, her voice trembling slightly. "But it's not like normal ones. They take kids who don't have anyone and they use them." "Use them for what?" Ethan demanded, leaning forward. Sophie swallowed hard. "Experiments, adoption rings, trafficking, bad things." Ethan felt a chill run down his spine. He had heard whispers of such places during his endless investigations, but never anything concrete. Could Lila really have ended up in such a nightmare? "And you're sure it was her?" he pressed, his voice cracking with desperation. Sophie nodded slowly. "She looks older now, but it's her. I'm certain." Ethan sank back into his chair, overwhelmed by a mix of hope and dread. If Sophie was telling the truth, then Lila might still be alive, but trapped in unimaginable circumstances. Yet how could he trust this stranger? What if she was lying, or worse, working for whoever had taken Lila? As if sensing his doubt, Sophie reached into her backpack and pulled out a crumpled piece of paper. "This is why I came," she said, handing it to him. Ethan unfolded the note, his eyes widening as he read the scrawled handwriting. It contained specific details about Lila, things only someone close to her would know. His pulse quickened. This wasn't some random scam. Whoever Sophie was, she knew something real. "Why are you helping me?" he asked, his voice softer now. Sophie looked away, her jaw tightening. "Because I want out too. And because..." She paused, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Because I think they'll come after me next." Ethan felt a pang of guilt. Whatever Sophie had been through, it clearly hadn't been easy. He realized then that he had two choices: turn her away and continue his lonely search, or take a leap of faith and let her guide him toward the truth. For the first time in years, Ethan allowed himself to feel a flicker of hope. But as he locked eyes with Sophie, he couldn't ignore the nagging suspicion that trusting her might come at a cost far greater than he could imagine. Ethan's mind was a whirlwind of emotions as he sat across from Sophie, the crumpled note still clutched in his hand. He had spent years chasing shadows, following leads that inevitably led to dead ends. But this was different. The details in the note were too specific, too personal to be fabricated. Yet the weight of hope was almost unbearable. What if she was wrong? What if this was just another cruel twist in a story that had already taken so much from him? Sophie shifted uncomfortably in her seat, sensing his internal struggle. "I know it's hard to believe me," she said softly, breaking the silence. "But I wouldn't have come here if I didn't think you deserved to know." Ethan looked at her. Really looked at her for the first time. She couldn't have been more than 12 or 13, yet her eyes carried the weariness of someone far older. There was a resilience in her gaze, a quiet determination that reminded him of Lila. It was that resemblance, however faint, that made him hesitate. "Tell me everything," he said finally, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. Sophie took a deep breath, as if steeling herself for what she was about to say. "The place where I saw your daughter, it's called Haven House. It's not on any map, and no one talks about it unless they're forced to. They take kids who don't have anyone, kids like me. At first it seems okay. They give you food, a bed, but then..." Her voice trailed off, and she stared down at her hands, which were trembling slightly. "Then what?" Ethan prompted gently, though his stomach churned with dread. "They start testing us," Sophie continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "Needles, machines, experiments. Some kids disappear after that. Others are sold to families who pay enough. And some stay there forever." Ethan felt bile rise in his throat. The thought of Lila enduring such horrors was almost too much to bear. But Sophie wasn't finished. "I saw her once during one of the tests," she said, her voice cracking. "She was scared, but she didn't cry. She kept saying your name over and over again, like she thought you'd come for her." Tears blurred Ethan's vision as he listened. For 5 long years, he had wondered if Lila even remembered him. Now, hearing that she had held on to his memory through unimaginable pain filled him with both pride and guilt. How could he have failed her so completely? "But why are you telling me this now?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. "Why risk coming here?" Sophie hesitated, her fingers twisting nervously around the strap of her backpack. "Because I'm running out of time," she admitted. "They found out I've been asking questions, trying to figure out how to escape. If I stay there much longer, I'll end up like the others." Her words sent a chill down Ethan's spine. He realized then that helping Sophie wasn't just about finding Lila. It was about saving another innocent life. But trusting her meant putting himself in danger, something he hadn't done since Lila's disappearance. Could he afford to take that risk? As if reading his thoughts, Sophie leaned forward, her expression earnest. "I can show you where Haven House is. I can help you find her, but we have to move fast. Ethan studied her face, searching for any sign of deceit. All he saw was fear and hope. Against all odds, he found himself nodding. "All right," he said, his voice firm despite the uncertainty gnawing at him. "We'll do this together." But as Sophie smiled faintly, relief washing over her features, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that their journey would lead them into darkness neither of them was prepared to face. Ethan's mind raced as he processed Sophie's words. Haven House, experiments, trafficking. Each revelation was more horrifying than the last, but it was the mention of Lila, his Lila, that struck him hardest. For 5 years, he had clung to the hope that she was alive, somewhere out there waiting for him to find her. Now, faced with the possibility that she had been subjected to unspeakable horrors, Ethan felt a surge of anger and guilt so intense it nearly overwhelmed him. But doubt lingered. Could Sophie truly be trusted? She was just a child, fragile and scared, yet her story aligned too perfectly with the fragmented pieces of information he had gathered over the years. Still, trusting her meant stepping into the unknown, a place where danger lurked around every corner. And yet what choice did he have? That night, after Sophie had fallen asleep on the couch in his study, Ethan sat alone at his desk, staring at the crumpled note she had given him. He unfolded it again, examining the handwriting. It wasn't neat or deliberate, it looked rushed, as if whoever wrote it had been afraid of being caught. But the details were undeniable. Descriptions of Lila's favorite stuffed animal, a locket she always wore, and even a phrase she used to say when she was little, "Daddy's girl forever." These weren't things a stranger could know unless they had seen her up close, unless they had spent time with her. Ethan's thoughts drifted back to the early days following Lila's disappearance. He remembered the endless phone calls to the police, the private investigators he hired, the reward money he offered. None of it had led anywhere. The authorities had treated the case like any other missing child report. But Ethan knew deep down that this was different. This wasn't a random kidnapping or a runaway scenario. Someone had taken her deliberately, and now, thanks to Sophie, he finally had a name to chase: Haven House. The next morning, Ethan woke before dawn, unable to sleep. His mind buzzed with questions. Where was Haven House located? Who ran it? And most importantly, how could he infiltrate such a place without putting himself and Sophie in greater danger? As the sun rose, casting golden light through the windows of his mansion, Ethan decided to dig deeper. He booted up his computer and began searching for anything related to Haven House. At first, there was nothing. No websites, no social media mentions, no public records. It was as if the place didn't exist. But then, buried in an obscure forum dedicated to conspiracy theories, he found a thread titled "Hidden Orphanages: The Truth Behind the Trafficking Rings." The posts were scattered and disjointed, written by users claiming to have inside knowledge of underground networks that exploited vulnerable children. One user, going by the handle Watcher 1984, described a facility hidden in the mountains outside Denver. According to the post, it operated under the guise of a charitable organization, but was actually a front for illegal adoptions and medical experiments. Ethan's heart pounded as he read further. Watcher 1984 claimed that the facility was run by a shadowy group known only as the Obsidian Circle. The name sent a shiver down his spine. He had heard whispers of such organizations during his investigations, but never anything concrete. Until now. He scrolled through the comments, looking for more clues when one reply caught his attention. It was brief, almost cryptic. "If you're looking for answers, follow the money. Start with Calder Industries." Ethan froze. Calder Industries, his own company. For a moment he thought he might be dreaming. How could his business, the empire he had built from scratch, be connected to something so vile? He shook his head, dismissing the idea as paranoia. Surely it was just a coincidence. Yet, the seed of suspicion had been planted, and he couldn't ignore it. Determined to uncover the truth, Ethan spent the rest of the day combing through financial records and corporate documents. What he discovered left him reeling. Over the past few years, several subsidiaries of Calder Industries had funneled large sums of money into offshore accounts linked to anonymous shell companies. On paper, the transactions appeared legitimate: donations to charities, investments in research facilities, but something about them felt off. Ethan's stomach churned as he pieced together the implications. If his company was involved in funding the very network responsible for Lila's disappearance, then he had unknowingly contributed to her suffering. The realization hit him like a freight train, leaving him breathless and nauseated. By evening, Sophie joined him in the study, her eyes wide with concern. "Are you okay?" she asked softly. Ethan hesitated, unsure of how much to tell her. Finally, he sighed and handed her a printout of the forum thread. "I think I know where we need to start," he said, his voice heavy with dread. Sophie scanned the page, her expression darkening as she read. When she looked up, her eyes were filled with a mixture of fear and resolve. "We can't do this alone," she said firmly. "We'll need help." Ethan nodded, though the thought of involving others made him uneasy. Trust was a luxury he couldn't afford right now. But Sophie was right. They couldn't take on the Obsidian Circle by themselves. As they discussed their next steps, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Every creak of the floorboards, every flicker of the lights, set his nerves on edge. He glanced out the window, half expecting to see someone lurking in the shadows. But the grounds were empty, bathed in the soft glow of twilight. Little did he know, the real threat was closer than he imagined. The weight of Ethan's discoveries pressed down on him like a suffocating blanket. The connection between Calder Industries and the Obsidian Circle gnawed at his conscience, but it was the fragments of his own past that began to surface that truly unsettled him. As he sat in his study, staring blankly at the documents spread across his desk, memories long buried resurfaced with startling clarity. He thought back to his childhood, a time when his father, Richard Calder, ruled their household with an iron fist. Richard had been a ruthless businessman, building Calder Industries from the ground up through sheer willpower and cutthroat tactics. To the outside world, he was a self-made millionaire, a symbol of success. But behind closed doors, he was a tyrant who demanded perfection from everyone around him, especially Ethan. Ethan remembered the nights he spent locked in his room after failing to meet his father's impossible standards. He recalled the sting of his father's words, sharper than any physical blow. "You'll never be half the man I am." Those words had haunted him for years, driving him to prove himself worthy, not just as a son, but as a father. And then there was Lila. From the moment she was born, she became the light in Ethan's life, the one person who made all the pain and struggle worth it. She was his redemption, his second chance at happiness. Losing her had shattered him in ways he couldn't articulate, leaving him adrift in a sea of guilt and regret. But now, as he pieced together the puzzle of her disappearance, he realized that his father's legacy might have played a role. Richard Calder had forged alliances with powerful and often dangerous people during his rise to prominence. Some of those relationships had ended badly, leaving behind enemies who might still hold grudges against the Calder name. Could one of those old adversaries be behind Lila's abduction? Was this some twisted form of revenge? Sophie interrupted his thoughts, appearing in the doorway with a tray of coffee. "I thought you could use this," she said softly, setting the tray on the desk. Ethan managed a weak smile. "Thanks." She hesitated, glancing at the papers scattered across the desk. "Are you okay?" He sighed, rubbing his temples. "Just thinking about the past, about my dad." Sophie tilted her head, curious. "What was he like?" Ethan chuckled bitterly. "Let's just say he wasn't the kind of man you'd want to cross. He built this company from nothing, but he didn't care who he stepped on to get there." "And you think he might have made enemies who would come after you?" Sophie asked, her voice tinged with concern. "It's possible," Ethan admitted, "but I don't know for sure. All I know is that whoever took Lila knew exactly how to hurt me. They didn't just take my daughter, they took everything that mattered." Sophie nodded slowly, her expression thoughtful. "Maybe we should look into your dad's old business dealings. See if anyone stands out." Ethan considered her suggestion. It was risky. Digging into his father's history meant confronting truths he had spent years trying to forget. But if it led him closer to finding Lila, he had no choice. Over the next few days, Ethan delved into his father's archives, uncovering records of deals gone sour, partnerships dissolved under mysterious circumstances, and lawsuits filed by disgruntled former associates. One name kept appearing: Victor Langston. Victor had been a rising star in the corporate world back in the 1980s, but his career had imploded after a high-profile scandal involving embezzlement and fraud. According to the files, Richard Calder had testified against him in court, sealing Victor's fate. After serving time in prison, Victor had vanished from public view, becoming little more than a ghost story whispered among industry insiders. Could Victor Langston be connected to the Obsidian Circle? Had he orchestrated Lila's abduction as payback for what Ethan's father had done to him decades ago? As Ethan pondered these questions, he noticed something strange. His phone buzzed incessantly with calls from unknown numbers, and his email inbox filled with cryptic messages warning him to stop digging. At first, he dismissed them as pranks, but when he returned home one evening to find his front gate ajar and footprints leading toward the house, he realized the danger was real. Someone was watching him. That night, unable to sleep, Ethan stood by the window, gazing out at the darkened grounds. The sense of being hunted was palpable, yet he couldn't shake the feeling that the answers he sought were within reach. He glanced over at Sophie, who lay asleep on the couch, her face illuminated by the soft glow of the moonlight streaming through the windows. Protecting her and finding Lila had become his sole purpose. No matter the cost, he vowed to see this through. Ethan's mind was a labyrinth of fragmented memories and unresolved questions. The name Victor Langston lingered in his thoughts like a shadow he couldn't shake. As he sifted through old files and newspaper clippings, the pieces of his father's legacy began to form a chilling mosaic. Richard Calder had been a man who thrived on power, but that power came at a cost: enemies who never forgot and never forgave. Sophie watched him quietly from across the room, her presence both comforting and unnerving. She seemed to sense the storm brewing inside him, yet she didn't press for details. Instead, she busied herself sketching in a notebook she carried everywhere. Ethan glanced at her occasionally, marveling at how someone so young could carry such weight on her shoulders. "Why do you draw?" he asked suddenly, breaking the silence. Sophie looked up, startled by the question. "It helps me remember," she said after a moment. "When I was at Haven House, they tried to make us forget things. Our names, our families. Drawing was the only way I could hold on to who I am." Her words struck a chord deep within Ethan. He thought about Lila, about how she used to doodle endlessly as a child, filling notebooks with pictures of their family. Had she drawn while she was trapped in that nightmare? Did she still think of him? The emotional toll of his search was becoming unbearable. Every lead felt like grasping at smoke, slipping through his fingers no matter how tightly he tried to hold on. Yet, there was something about Sophie's resilience that kept him grounded. Her determination reminded him of Lila, a quiet strength that refused to be extinguished. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the mansion's grounds, Ethan decided to visit an old acquaintance, Marcus Hale. Once a decorated detective, Marcus had fallen from grace after being implicated in a corruption scandal. Though disgraced, he still had connections that might prove invaluable in unraveling the web surrounding the Obsidian Circle. Ethan drove into the city under the cover of darkness, his car weaving through streets lined with flickering streetlights. The address he had for Marcus was tucked away in a rundown apartment complex on the outskirts of town. As he climbed the creaky stairs to the third floor, he couldn't help but feel a pang of unease. Was this a mistake? Could he trust someone with such a tarnished reputation? Marcus answered the door after a hesitant knock, his face weathered and weary. He squinted at Ethan, recognition dawning slowly. "Ethan Calder," he muttered, stepping aside to let him in. "Never thought I'd see you here." The apartment was sparse, cluttered with stacks of papers and empty coffee cups. Marcus gestured for Ethan to sit. then poured 2 glasses of whiskey from a dusty bottle. "What brings you to my neck of the woods?" Ethan hesitated, unsure of how much to reveal. Finally, he handed Marcus a folder containing the information he had gathered about the Obsidian Circle. "I need your help," he admitted. "This group. They're connected to my daughter's disappearance." Marcus flipped through the documents, his expression growing darker with each page. When he finally looked up, his eyes were sharp, calculating. "You're playing with fire, Ethan. These people don't mess around." "I don't have a choice," Ethan replied firmly. "If there's even a chance they have my daughter, I have to find her." Marcus studied him for a long moment before nodding. "All right, but if we're doing this, we do it my way. No shortcuts, no mistakes." Relief washed over Ethan, though it was tinged with apprehension. He knew Marcus wasn't offering his help out of kindness. There was likely a price to pay. But for now, he was willing to accept whatever terms came with it. As they discussed their next steps, Ethan couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that they were being watched. Earlier that day, he had noticed a black sedan parked outside his mansion, its windows tinted too dark to see inside. Now, as he left Marcus's apartment, he spotted the same car idling at the curb. His heart raced as he hurried back to his vehicle, glancing over his shoulder every few seconds. Whoever was following him wasn't trying very hard to hide, and that worried him more than anything. Back at the mansion, Sophie greeted him with wide eyes. "Something's wrong," she whispered urgently. "There was a man here earlier. He said he needed to talk to you." Ethan froze. "What did he look like?" "He had dark hair and wore a suit," Sophie explained. "He didn't seem dangerous, but I don't know, something about him felt off." Ethan's stomach churned. It seemed their enemies were closing in, and time was running out. But amidst the chaos, one thing became clear. The past he had tried so desperately to escape was now colliding with the present in ways he could never have anticipated. Ethan's resolve hardened as he stood in the dimly lit study, staring at the map spread across his desk. The pieces were beginning to fall into place, fragile, disjointed fragments that hinted at a larger, more sinister puzzle. But now was not the time for hesitation. Now was the moment to act. With Marcus Hale reluctantly on board, and Sophie's knowledge of Haven House as their only leads, Ethan knew they couldn't afford any missteps. Every decision carried weight. Every move could either bring him closer to Lila or push her further away. The stakes had never been higher. Sophie watched him intently as he outlined their plan. "We need to gather as much intel as possible before we make a move," Ethan said, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. "Marcus, I want you to dig deeper into these offshore accounts. Find out who's pulling the strings behind the Obsidian Circle. Sophie, you'll help me map out Haven House, the layout, the routines, anything you remember." Marcus nodded, though his expression remained skeptical. "This isn't going to be easy. These people don't leave trails unless they want you to find them." "I don't care how hard it is," Ethan snapped, his patience wearing thin. "If there's even a chance my daughter is alive, I'll tear this whole operation apart piece by piece if I have to." Sophie flinched at the intensity in his voice but didn't back down. Instead, she reached into her backpack and pulled out a worn notebook filled with sketches and scribbled notes. "I've been trying to remember everything since I left," she explained softly. "It's not much, but maybe it'll help." Ethan took the notebook from her, flipping through its pages. Each drawing depicted scenes from Haven House. A barred window here, a shadowy hallway there. Some entries included descriptions of faces she'd seen, names whispered in hushed tones. It wasn't perfect, but it was more than he'd had before. As they worked together, Ethan noticed something remarkable about Sophie. Despite her youth, she possessed an uncanny ability to recall details others might overlook. Her observations weren't just random. They were precise, almost clinical. It was as if she had trained herself to notice things, perhaps as a survival mechanism during her time at Haven House. But as the hours passed, Ethan couldn't ignore the growing tension between himself and Marcus. The former detective seemed uneasy, constantly glancing over his shoulder, as if expecting someone to burst through the door at any moment. When Ethan confronted him about it, Marcus hesitated before speaking. there's something you should know," Marcus admitted finally, his tone grave. "Victor Langston, he's not just some washed-up corporate shark. He's connected to the Obsidian Circle, and if he finds out we're sniffing around, we're dead." The name sent a chill down Ethan's spine. Victor Langston, the man whose life Richard Calder had ruined all those years ago. Could this really be personal? Had Victor orchestrated Lila's abduction as revenge against the Calder family? Before Ethan could respond, the sound of breaking glass shattered the silence. All three of them froze, their eyes darting toward the source of the noise. A rock lay on the floor near the shattered remains of the study window, a folded note tied to it with string. Ethan approached cautiously, picking up the rock and unfolding the note. The message was brief but chilling. "Stop digging or your daughter dies." Sophie gasped, clutching the edge of the desk for support. Even Marcus looked shaken, his usual bravado replaced by unease. For a moment, no one spoke. The threat hung heavy in the air, a stark reminder of the danger they were facing. But instead of fear, Ethan felt a surge of determination. Whoever was behind this wanted him to back off, which meant he was getting close. Too close. "We keep going," he declared firmly, crumpling the note in his fist. "They think they can scare us into stopping. But they're wrong. We're not giving up, not now, not ever." Sophie nodded, her earlier fear replaced by resolve. "What's the next step?" Ethan glanced at Marcus, who sighed deeply but gave a reluctant nod. "We hit them where it hurts," Marcus said grimly. "Follow the money trail. If we can expose whoever's funding this operation, we might be able to bring the whole thing crashing down." It was a risky strategy, one that required precision and timing. But Ethan knew they didn't have a choice. With each passing day, the clock ticked closer to an unknown deadline, one that could mean life or death for Lila. As they prepared for the next phase of their mission, Ethan allowed himself a rare moment of reflection. He thought about the path that had led him here, the choices he'd made, the sacrifices he'd endured, and he realized that, win or lose, this journey would change him forever. But for now, there was only one thing that mattered: finding Lila and bringing her home. The air in the study was thick with anticipation as Sophie and Marcus pored over documents, maps, and photographs. Each piece of evidence they uncovered felt like a thread pulling at the edges of a tightly woven tapestry, threatening to unravel the entire facade of the Obsidian Circle. Yet, for every answer they found, two more questions emerged, leaving them caught in a web of uncertainty. Marcus had spent the night tracing the financial transactions linked to Calder Industries' subsidiaries. What he discovered chilled him to the bone. The offshore accounts weren't just conduits for money laundering. They were funding something far darker. Medical equipment purchases, experimental research grants, and payments to private security firms painted a grim picture. It seemed the Obsidian Circle wasn't merely trafficking children. They were using them as test subjects for some kind of clandestine operation. "They're not just selling kids," Marcus said, his voice low and grave. "They're experimenting on them." Ethan's stomach churned at the thought of Lila being subjected to such horrors. He clenched his fists, forcing himself to stay focused. "Do we know where these experiments are happening?" Marcus hesitated before answering. "There's a facility listed in one of the invoices, a lab in the mountains outside Denver. But it's heavily guarded. If Haven House is connected to this place, getting in won't be easy." Sophie nodded solemnly, her eyes fixed on the map spread across the desk. She pointed to a cluster of markings she'd made earlier. "This is where I think Haven House is. It's hidden in the woods near that lab. I remember seeing trucks going back and forth between the two places." Ethan studied the map, his mind racing. The proximity of the two locations suggested a direct link. If they could infiltrate Haven House, they might be able to gather enough evidence to expose the entire network. But the risks were astronomical. One wrong move, and they'd all end up dead, or worse. As the morning light filtered through the broken window, Ethan noticed Sophie shivering slightly. He grabbed a blanket from the couch and draped it around her shoulders. "You've been through so much already," he said gently. "Are you sure you want to keep doing this?" Sophie looked up at him, her expression resolute. I have to. Not just for your daughter, but for everyone else stuck there. If we don't stop them, no one will. Her words struck a chord deep within Ethan. This wasn't just about finding Lila anymore. It was about dismantling a system that preyed on the vulnerable. For the first time since her disappearance, he felt a glimmer of purpose beyond his own grief, but their progress came at a cost. That afternoon, as they prepared to leave the mansion to scout the area around Haven House, Ethan received a call from an unknown number. The voice on the other end was distorted, mechanical, and cold. You've been warned once, it said. Back off, or the girl dies. Ethan's blood ran cold. They knew about Sophie, which meant they were watching them closely, perhaps even inside the mansion itself. Who is this? Ethan demanded, his voice trembling with anger, but the line went dead. Marcus arrived moments later, his face pale. We've got a problem, he said. Holding up his phone, a text message displayed a single image, a surveillance photo of Sophie standing in the study, taken from an angle that suggested someone had been inside the house. They're here, Marcus whispered. And they're not playing games. Panic surged through Ethan, but he quickly suppressed it. Now wasn't the time to lose control. Instead, he turned to Sophie, who stood frozen in fear. Pack your things, he instructed firmly. We're leaving, right now. But where will we go? Sophie asked, her voice quivering. Somewhere safe, Ethan replied. Somewhere they won't find us. As they hurriedly gathered their belongings, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that they were running out of time. Every clue brought them closer to the truth, but also deeper into danger. And yet, despite the mounting pressure, he refused to give up. Not when Lila's life hung in the balance. The weight of the surveillance photo pressed heavily on Ethan's mind as they fled the mansion under the cover of darkness. Every shadow seemed to stretch longer, every sound louder, as if the world itself conspired against them. Sophie clutched her backpack tightly, her knuckles white, while Marcus drove in tense silence. None of them spoke, but the unspoken understanding hung thick in the air. They were being hunted. Ethan's thoughts raced as he replayed the distorted voice from the anonymous call. Back off, or the girl dies. It wasn't just a threat, it was a declaration of intent. Whoever was behind this knew their every move, and they weren't afraid to escalate. But what chilled him most was the realization that Sophie wasn't merely collateral damage. She was central to their plans. Why? What did she know that made her such a target? They reached a secluded cabin deep in the woods, far from prying eyes. Marcus had arranged it weeks earlier as part of his contingency plan, a safe house for when things went south. The irony wasn't lost on Ethan. Things had gone south long before any of them could have imagined. Inside, the cabin was sparse but functional. A single bulb cast flickering light over the wooden furniture, and the faint scent of damp earth lingered in the air. Sophie curled up on the couch, wrapping herself in the blanket Ethan had given her earlier. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with fear. Yet there was something else beneath the surface, a quiet determination that mirrored his own. We need answers, Ethan said finally, breaking the silence. Sophie, tell me everything you remember about Haven House. Anything unusual, no matter how small. Sophie hesitated, then nodded. She opened her notebook and began flipping through the pages, her fingers tracing over sketches and scribbled notes. There was a man, she said softly. He came sometimes late at night. He didn't look like the others. He wore suits, carried briefcases. The kids called him the doctor, but I don't think he was really a doctor. Ethan leaned forward, his heart pounding. Did you ever hear his name? Sophie shook her head. No, but I saw him arguing with someone once. They mentioned Calder Industries. The room fell silent. Even Marcus stopped pacing, his expression darkening. Ethan felt the ground shift beneath him. His company, the empire he had built, was entangled in this nightmare more deeply than he had feared. What else? Ethan pressed, his voice tight. There were experiments, Sophie continued, her voice trembling. I saw them take kids away and some never came back. Others returned. Different. Quiet. Broken. Marcus cursed under his breath, running a hand through his graying hair. This is worse than I thought. If they're using children for medical trials, we're dealing with something beyond trafficking. This is human experimentation. Ethan's stomach churned at the thought of Lila enduring such horrors. He clenched his fists, forcing himself to stay focused. We need proof, something concrete we can use to expose them. Sophie hesitated again, then reached into her backpack and pulled out a small USB drive. I took this before I escaped, she whispered. It has files from one of the computers at Haven House. I didn't know what was on it until now. Ethan stared at the tiny device, his pulse quickening. Could this be the break they needed? He plugged it into his laptop, holding his breath as the files loaded. What he saw made his blood run cold. The documents contained detailed logs of experiments conducted on children. Names, dates, procedures, results. Among them was a file labeled Subject L07. Ethan clicked it open, his hands shaking. The screen displayed a photograph of Lila, her face gaunt and hollow, her eyes filled with despair. Beneath the image was a list of treatments and observations, written in clinical detachment. She's alive, Ethan whispered, tears streaming down his face. She's still alive. But the relief was short-lived. As he scrolled further, he found something even more horrifying, a video file dated just weeks ago. With trembling hands, he clicked play. The footage showed Lila sitting in a sterile room, her wrists bound to a chair. Her voice was weak, barely audible, but the words cut through Ethan like a knife. Daddy, if you're watching this, please find me. They're doing things to us, things I don't understand. I'm scared. The recording ended abruptly, leaving Ethan paralyzed with grief and rage. He turned to Sophie, who sat frozen, tears streaming down her cheeks. Why didn't you tell me about this sooner? He demanded, his voice cracking. I was scared, Sophie cried. I didn't know if you'd believe me or if they'd come after me again. Ethan wanted to scream, to lash out at the injustice of it all, but instead he sank to his knees, pulling Sophie into a tight embrace. I'm sorry, he murmured. I'm so sorry. Marcus watched silently. His jaw clenched. This changes everything, he said finally. If we can get this footage to the right people, we might be able to bring the whole operation down. But it won't be easy. They'll come after us harder than ever. Ethan nodded, his resolve hardening. For the first time since Lila's disappearance, he had tangible evidence of her suffering and of the monsters responsible. He would do whatever it took to save her, no matter the cost. As the night wore on, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that they were running out of time. The clock was ticking, not just for Lila, but for everyone caught in the Obsidian Circle's web. And somewhere out there, the man in the suit, the one Sophie called the doctor, was waiting. The weight of the USB drive's contents bore down on Ethan like an invisible force, pressing against his chest and clouding his thoughts. Every image, every log entry, every second of that video replayed in his mind like a broken record. Lila, his bright, fearless daughter, reduced to a shadow of herself, pleading for help from a sterile cell. It was unbearable, but as much as the pain threatened to consume him, it also fueled his determination. He couldn't afford to break. Not now. Sophie sat across from him at the cabin's small table. Her hands wrapped tightly around a mug of tea she hadn't touched. Her eyes darted nervously toward the windows, as if expecting someone to burst through at any moment. Marcus paced the room, muttering under his breath about contingency plans and escape routes. None of them had slept since arriving. Fear and adrenaline kept them wired. We need to move quickly, Marcus said finally, stopping mid-stride. If they know we have this data, they'll come after us hard. Ethan nodded absently, still staring at the laptop screen. But where do we start? We can't just storm into Haven House or that lab. They'll be ready for us. Sophie spoke up hesitantly, her voice barely above a whisper. There's one place we haven't looked yet, a storage facility near Haven House. They used to send trucks there sometimes. I don't know what's inside, but maybe it's important. Ethan glanced at her, surprised by the suggestion. "Why didn't you mention this before?" "I forgot," Sophie admitted, her cheeks flushing with guilt. "It didn't seem important until now." Marcus crossed the room and leaned over the map spread across the table. A storage facility could mean anything: supplies, records, even more evidence. If we can get in without being detected, we might find something useful. "But how?" Ethan asked, frustration creeping into his tone. "We're already compromised. They know who we are, where we've been. How do we stay ahead of them?" Marcus hesitated, then reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a burner phone. "I have contacts, people who owe me favors. We can use them to create diversions. Throw them off our trail, but it'll cost us." "Money isn't an issue," Ethan snapped. "Just tell me what we need to do." As Marcus began making calls, Ethan turned his attention back to Sophie. She looked exhausted, her young face etched with worry lines no child should carry. He knelt beside her, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You've done so much already," he said softly. "Are you sure you want to keep going? You don't have to do this." Sophie met his gaze, her expression unwavering despite the fear in her eyes. "Yes, I do. Not just for Lila, for everyone else too. If we stop now, they win." Her words struck a chord deep within Ethan. This wasn't just about rescuing his daughter anymore. It was about dismantling a system that thrived on suffering. And Sophie, despite everything she'd endured, refused to give up. That resolve gave him strength. By morning, Marcus had arranged their next move. A local journalist sympathetic to his cause agreed to leak fragments of the USB drive's data to trusted outlets, creating enough noise to draw attention away from their operation. Meanwhile, Marcus's contacts would stage a series of minor disruptions near Haven House and the lab, diverting security forces temporarily. "We'll have a narrow window," Marcus explained as they packed supplies into the car. "No mistakes, no hesitation. Get in, grab whatever you can, and get out." Ethan nodded, though his stomach churned with unease. The plan was risky, bordering on reckless. But they had no other options. The journey to the storage facility took them through winding forest roads, the dense trees providing cover from prying eyes. As they approached, Ethan noticed signs of recent activity: tire tracks in the mud, fresh footprints leading toward the building. His heart sank. Had they been discovered already? Sophie pointed to a side entrance partially obscured by overgrown bushes. "That's where the trucks usually went in," she whispered. "Maybe it's unlocked." They moved cautiously, staying low and avoiding open spaces. When they reached the door, Ethan tested the handle. It gave way with a soft click. Inside, the air was cool and musty, filled with the faint scent of chemicals. Rows of crates and shelves stretched into the dimly lit interior, their contents hidden beneath tarps and locks. "This is it," Marcus murmured, pulling out a flashlight. "Let's split up. Look for anything marked medical or research." As they searched, Ethan's mind raced. What were they looking for? What could possibly justify the horrors inflicted on those children? Each discovery, a crate of syringes, a stack of medical files, only deepened the mystery. Then, Sophie called out softly from the far end of the warehouse. "Over here!" Ethan hurried to her side, finding her crouched beside a locked cabinet. Its surface bore the insignia of Calder Industries. With shaking hands, he forced it open, revealing stacks of documents and vials labeled with cryptic codes. And then he saw it, a photograph tucked into the corner of the drawer. It showed Richard Calder, his father, shaking hands with a man in a suit. Beneath the image was a caption, "Victor Langston, Project Genesis." Ethan's blood ran cold. His father had been involved. Somehow, impossibly, he had known about this all along. Before he could process the revelation, the sound of footsteps echoed through the warehouse. Heavy boots, multiple pairs. "They're here," Marcus hissed, drawing a gun from his belt. "Get behind me." Ethan grabbed Sophie's hand, pulling her close. For the first time since beginning this journey, he felt truly trapped. But as the footsteps grew louder, he realized something crucial. They weren't alone anymore. The sound of approaching footsteps echoed through the storage facility, each step reverberating like a drumbeat signaling impending doom. Ethan tightened his grip on Sophie's hand, his other hand instinctively reaching for the small handgun Marcus had given him earlier. The weight of the weapon felt foreign in his palm. He wasn't a man accustomed to violence, but desperation made him willing to do whatever it took to protect her and uncover the truth. Marcus stood at the edge of the aisle, his posture tense as he peered into the shadows. "Stay behind me," he whispered, his voice low but firm. "If things go south, grab Sophie and run." Ethan nodded, though the thought of leaving Marcus behind filled him with guilt. They were in this together now, bound by a shared mission that none of them could abandon. Still, survival instincts kicked in, and he positioned himself between Sophie and the advancing threat. The footsteps grew louder, accompanied by the faint murmur of voices. Two figures emerged from the darkness, their silhouettes illuminated by the dim light filtering through cracks in the walls. One was tall and broad-shouldered, while the other was slighter, almost unassuming. Both wore tactical gear, their faces obscured by masks. "Who's there?" Marcus called out, his tone authoritative despite the tension radiating off him. The taller figure raised a hand, signaling for his companion to lower their weapon. "We're not here to hurt you," he said, his voice calm but edged with urgency. "We've been sent by someone who wants to help." Ethan exchanged a wary glance with Marcus. Help? From whom? And why would anyone risk exposing themselves to assist strangers caught in the crosshairs of the Obsidian Circle? "Sent by who?" Ethan demanded, his voice sharp with suspicion. The man hesitated before answering. "My name is Daniel Cross. I used to work for Victor Langston until I realized what he was really doing, what all of you are involved in." The mention of Victor's name sent a jolt through Ethan. Everything seemed to circle back to him. The experiments, Haven House, even Calder Industries. Was this man telling the truth, or was he another pawn in the game? Daniel stepped closer, keeping his hands visible as a gesture of goodwill. "I know about your daughter," he continued, addressing Ethan directly. "And I know about Sophie. You're running out of time. If you want to save them both, you'll need more than just courage." Sophie clung to Ethan's side, her breathing shallow. She didn't speak, but her wide eyes conveyed everything she couldn't put into words: fear, hope, uncertainty. "How do we know we can trust you?" Marcus asked, his gun still trained on Daniel. "You don't," Daniel admitted bluntly. "But if I wanted you dead, you'd already be lying on the floor. Instead, I'm offering you a way out and a chance to take down the people responsible for this nightmare." Ethan's mind raced. Could they afford to gamble on this stranger's word? Every instinct screamed at him to retreat, to protect Sophie and focus solely on finding Lila. Yet something about Daniel's demeanor struck him as genuine. There was no arrogance, no attempt to manipulate. They were standing face to face with a man who looked as haunted as they felt. "What do you want from us?" Ethan asked finally, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. "I need your help to expose Victor," Daniel replied. "He's planning something big, something that could make everything you've uncovered look insignificant. But I can't stop him alone." Marcus cursed under his breath, lowering his weapon slightly. "This keeps getting worse. It gets worse before it gets better," Daniel said grimly. "But if we act fast, we might have a shot." Ethan turned to Sophie, searching her face for any sign of hesitation. Her expression was unreadable, torn between fear and resolve. Finally, she gave a small nod, trusting Ethan to make the decision. "All right," Ethan said, turning back to Daniel. "But if you're lying to us, I swear—" "I understand," Daniel interrupted, his tone serious. "You won't get a second chance with me either." With that uneasy alliance forged, Daniel led them deeper into the storage facility, explaining what he knew along the way. According to him, Victor Langston had been using the Obsidian Circle as a front for a much larger operation, one tied to genetic experimentation and illegal biotechnology. The children abducted from Haven House weren't just test subjects, they were part of an effort to create something unprecedented. "What exactly is he trying to create?" Ethan asked, dread pooling in his stomach. Daniel hesitated, as if choosing his words carefully. A new kind of human, stronger, smarter, immune to disease. He calls it Project Genesis. The implications hit Ethan like a freight train. His father's involvement suddenly made sickening sense. Richard Calder hadn't just been funding Victor's schemes, he had been complicit in shaping them. The photograph Ethan had found earlier confirmed it. Two men, united by greed and ambition, willing to sacrifice innocent lives for power. As they reached a hidden compartment within the facility, Daniel retrieved a set of documents detailing Victor's plans. Among them were blueprints for a massive underground lab located beneath the mountains, a place where the final stages of Project Genesis were being conducted. "This is where we'll find your daughter," Daniel said, handing the papers to Ethan. "But getting in won't be easy. Security is tight and Victor knows you're coming." Ethan studied the blueprints, his heart pounding. This was it, their best and only lead. Failure wasn't an option. "We'll figure it out," Marcus muttered, though his expression suggested he wasn't entirely convinced. As they prepared to leave the storage facility, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that Daniel's arrival was too convenient. Was he truly an ally, or was he setting them up for a trap? Only time would tell. But one thing was certain, the stakes had never been higher. The blueprints Daniel had provided were intricate, detailing a labyrinth of tunnels and chambers beneath the mountains. According to him, this underground facility, dubbed Genesis Base, was where Victor Langston conducted his most secretive experiments. It was also where Lila was being held. But as Ethan studied the plans, one thing became painfully clear. Breaching the base would be nearly impossible. "This place is a fortress," Marcus muttered, shaking his head. "Even with all our resources, getting in undetected is going to take a miracle." Ethan clenched his jaw, frustration bubbling beneath the surface. He couldn't afford doubt. Not now, not when they were so close. "We don't have a choice," he said firmly. "If this is where they're keeping my daughter, then this is where we're going." Sophie sat quietly in the corner of the cabin, her eyes fixed on the floor. She hadn't spoken much since leaving the storage facility, but Ethan could see the storm brewing behind her gaze. Whatever she was thinking, it wasn't good. "Are you okay?" he asked gently, kneeling beside her. She hesitated before nodding, though her expression betrayed her unease. I keep thinking about Haven House. What if we fail? What if they catch us again?" Ethan placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "We won't let that happen, I promise." But even as he spoke the words, he felt the weight of his promise pressing down on him. Promises were easy to make. Keeping them was another matter entirely. Daniel, who had been silent until now, cleared his throat. "There's a way in," he said cautiously. "A service tunnel that leads directly into the lower levels of the base. It's risky, it's monitored, but if we time it right, we might slip through unnoticed." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "And how do you know about this tunnel?" "I helped design it," Daniel admitted. "Before I realized what Victor was really doing." Ethan exchanged a glance with Marcus. Trusting Daniel still felt like walking a tightrope without a safety net, but they didn't have any better options. If the tunnel was their only chance, they had to take it. "All right," Ethan said finally, "we'll use the tunnel. But we need a plan, something more than just hoping for the best." Over the next few hours, they devised a strategy. Daniel would lead the way, using his knowledge of the base's layout to guide them through the service tunnel. Marcus would handle security systems, disabling cameras and alarms as needed. Ethan's role was simple but critical: protect Sophie at all costs. As night fell, they prepared for the mission. Each piece of equipment, a flashlight, a lockpick set, a small medical kit, was carefully packed into backpacks. Every detail mattered, every second counted. Before they left, Ethan pulled Sophie aside. "Listen to me," he said, his voice low but firm. "No matter what happens, stay close to me. If things go wrong, run. Don't look back." Tears welled up in her eyes, but she nodded bravely. "I won't leave you," she whispered. Ethan wanted to argue, to insist that her safety came first, but he knew it wouldn't change her mind. Instead, he hugged her tightly, committing the moment to memory. For all he knew, it might be their last. The journey to Genesis Base was grueling. They traveled under the cover of darkness, navigating treacherous mountain paths and avoiding patrols. By the time they reached the entrance to the service tunnel, exhaustion clung to them like a second skin. "This is it," Daniel murmured, shining a flashlight into the narrow passageway. "From here on out, every step counts." They moved cautiously, their footsteps muffled by the damp earth beneath them. The air grew colder the deeper they went, carrying with it the faint scent of chemicals and decay. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest, each beat echoing like a drum roll in the oppressive silence. Halfway through the tunnel, Marcus froze, holding up a hand to signal the others to stop. "Camera ahead," he whispered, pulling out a small device. "Give me a minute." While Marcus worked, Ethan scanned their surroundings, his senses on high alert. Shadows danced along the walls, playing tricks on his mind. Was that movement, a sound, or just his imagination? Then, without warning, a sharp crack echoed through the tunnel. Marcus cursed under his breath, dropping the device as sparks flew from the wall panel he'd been tampering with. "What happened?" Ethan hissed, drawing his gun instinctively. "I tripped an alarm," Marcus admitted grimly. "We've got maybe 2 minutes before they find us." Panic surged through Ethan, but he forced himself to stay calm. "Keep moving," he ordered. "We can't turn back now." They sprinted forward, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. The tunnel seemed endless, twisting and turning like a snake coiled around its prey. Just as Ethan began to fear they'd never reach the end, a faint light appeared ahead. "There!" Daniel shouted, pointing toward the opening. "Go! Go!" They burst into a large chamber, only to skid to a halt as armed guards emerged from the shadows, weapons trained on them. Ethan's stomach dropped. They had walked straight into a trap. "Well, well," a familiar voice drawled from the far side of the room. "Look who decided to pay us a visit." Ethan's blood ran cold as Victor Langston stepped into view, a smug smile playing on his lips. Beside him stood someone else, someone Ethan recognized instantly. It was his brother, Victor Calder. The chamber was suffocating, the air thick with tension as Victor Langston and Ethan's brother, Victor Calder, stepped forward. Their presence felt like a vice tightening around Ethan's chest. His mind raced, trying to piece together how his own flesh and blood could be entangled in this nightmare. Victor Calder, his younger brother, the one he had protected since childhood, was now standing beside the man responsible for Lila's abduction. Betrayal burned in Ethan's veins, hotter than any anger he'd ever known. But there was no time to process it. Armed guards surrounded them, their weapons trained on the group. One wrong move, and they'd all be dead. "Well, Ethan," Victor Langston drawled, his voice dripping with mockery. "I have to admit I didn't expect you to make it this far. You've been quite the nuisance." Ethan clenched his fists, forcing himself to stay calm despite the storm raging inside him. "Where's my daughter?" he demanded, his voice cutting through the oppressive silence. Victor Langston smirked, glancing at Victor Calder. "Your daughter? Oh, she's safe, for now. Though I'm not sure she'll thank you for coming here. This place isn't exactly hospitable." Sophie clung to Ethan's side, her small frame trembling. He placed a protective hand on her shoulder, silently vowing to shield her no matter what. Marcus and Daniel exchanged wary glances, both clearly assessing their options. They were outnumbered and outgunned, but surrender wasn't an option. "What do you want from us?" Ethan asked, his tone sharp with defiance. Victor Langston chuckled darkly. "What do I want? Simple. I want you to stop interfering. Project Genesis is too important to let someone like you ruin it." "Project Genesis?" Ethan spat. "You're experimenting on children. Innocent lives are being destroyed because of your greed." Victor's expression hardened, the amusement fading from his face. "You think this is about greed? No, Ethan. This is about evolution, about creating something better, something stronger. And if a few sacrifices are necessary along the way, so be it." Ethan's stomach churned at the coldness in Victor's voice. This man truly believed in his twisted vision, a future built on the suffering of others. But before Ethan could respond, Victor Calder spoke up, his voice quieter but equally chilling. "You don't understand, Ethan," Victor said. "No." Stepping closer. Father knew what he was doing when he invested in this project. He saw the potential, the power, and now, thanks to Victor Langston, we're on the verge of something extraordinary. Ethan stared at his brother, disbelief warring with fury. Father was complicit in this, in abducting children. In torturing them? Victor hesitated, his gaze flickering with guilt before hardening again. It's not that simple. Father did what he thought was best. For the family, for the future. You wouldn't understand because you've always been too soft, too sentimental. The words hit Ethan like a punch to the gut. His father, the man who had shaped his entire life, had been part of this horror show. Every lesson, every expectation, every demand had been rooted in this monstrous legacy. The realization left him reeling, but he refused to let it break him. "You're wrong," Ethan growled, his voice low and dangerous. "I understand perfectly. You're monsters, both of you." Victor Langston laughed, shaking his head. "Monsters? Perhaps. But history remembers victors, not victims, and we will win." Before Ethan could respond, Sophie suddenly stepped forward, her voice ringing out with surprising strength. "You won't win," she declared, her eyes blazing with defiance. "People know about you now. They'll stop you." Victor Langston's smile faltered for a moment, his gaze narrowing as he studied Sophie. "Ah, yes. The little runaway. You've caused quite a bit of trouble yourself." Sophie didn't flinch even as the guards raised their weapons slightly. "You can't scare me anymore. I'm not afraid of you." Her bravery ignited something within Ethan, a spark of hope amidst the despair. If a child could stand up to these men, then so could he. Slowly, he reached into his pocket, his fingers brushing against the USB drive containing the evidence they had gathered. It was their only leverage, their only chance. "If you hurt her or anyone else, I'll make sure the world knows everything," Ethan warned, holding the drive up for emphasis. "Every experiment, every crime, everything." Victor Langston's smirk returned, though there was a flicker of unease in his eyes. "And how do you plan to do that, Ethan? You're trapped, outnumbered, outmatched." Ethan didn't answer. Instead, he glanced at Marcus, who gave a subtle nod. They had rehearsed this moment during their preparation, a desperate gamble, but one they had to take. In a flash, chaos erupted. Marcus lunged toward the nearest guard, disarming him with practiced precision. Daniel tackled another, using his knowledge of the base to exploit blind spots. Ethan grabbed Sophie, pulling her behind a stack of crates as gunfire echoed through the chamber. The sound was deafening, each bullet whizzing past like a deadly whisper. Ethan's heart pounded as he shielded Sophie, his mind screaming at him to keep moving. They couldn't stay pinned down for long. "Stay close," he shouted over the noise, dragging her toward a narrow corridor leading deeper into the facility. Behind them, Marcus and Daniel fought valiantly, buying them precious seconds. As they ran, Ethan's thoughts raced. They had made it this far, but the battle was far from over. Victor Langston and his brother weren't going to let them escape, not without a fight. And somewhere in this labyrinth, Lila was waiting. The narrow corridor twisted and turned like a snake coiled beneath the earth, its walls lined with exposed pipes and flickering fluorescent lights. Ethan's breath came in ragged gasps as he pulled Sophie along, their footsteps echoing sharply against the cold metal floor. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit grew louder, shouts, boots pounding, the occasional crack of gunfire ricocheting off the walls. "We can't keep running forever," Marcus panted as he caught up to them. His face pale but resolute. Blood trickled from a gash on his forehead, evidence of the chaos they had left behind. "We need to find Lila now, or this was all for nothing." Ethan didn't respond. His mind was racing, trying to piece together the labyrinthine layout of Genesis Base. Daniel had mentioned that the lower levels housed holding cells where the children were kept during experiments. If they could reach those cells, they might finally be reunited with Lila. But every step forward felt like stepping deeper into a trap. Sophie tugged at Ethan's sleeve, her voice trembling but urgent. "This way," she whispered, pointing toward a dimly lit junction ahead. "I remember something like this from Haven House. It leads to the labs." Ethan hesitated, glancing back at Marcus and Daniel, who nodded grimly. They had no choice but to trust her instincts. With a deep breath, Ethan followed Sophie down the corridor, his heart hammering in his chest. As they rounded a corner, the air shifted, colder, heavier, laced with the sterile tang of antiseptic. The walls were smoother here, the lighting harsher, illuminating rows of reinforced doors marked with alphanumeric codes. Each door seemed identical, yet Sophie moved with purpose, her small frame weaving between the shadows until she stopped abruptly in front of one labeled Cell Block D7. "This is it," she said softly, her hand hovering over the keypad beside the door. "They brought me here once after the tests." Ethan exchanged a glance with Marcus, who quickly set to work bypassing the lock. Within moments, the door hissed open, revealing a sight that froze Ethan in place. Inside the cell, huddled against the far wall, was Lila. She looked older, thinner, her once bright eyes dulled by exhaustion and fear. Her hair was matted, her clothes torn and stained, but there was no mistaking her. She was alive. "Lila," Ethan choked out, his voice breaking as tears streamed down his face. For a moment, she didn't react, staring at him as if unsure whether he was real. Then slowly, recognition dawned, and she scrambled to her feet, throwing herself into his arms. Ethan held her tightly, afraid to let go, afraid she might disappear if he did. Sophie watched silently, tears streaming down her own cheeks as the reunion unfolded. But before anyone could speak, a sharp voice cut through the silence. How touching. They turned to see Victor Langston standing in the doorway, flanked by armed guards. His expression was calm, almost amused, as if their escape attempt amused him more than anything else. Beside him stood Victor Calder, his brother's face unreadable, though his hands trembled slightly at his sides. "You really thought you could waltz in here and take her?" Victor Langston sneered, stepping closer. "You're more foolish than I gave you credit for, Ethan." Ethan tightened his grip on Lila, shielding her with his body. "Stay away from us," he growled, his voice low and dangerous. Victor Langston chuckled darkly. "Oh, I don't think so. You see, your daughter is special. She's part of something bigger than you'll ever understand." "What are you talking about?" Ethan demanded, his mind reeling. Victor's smirk widened. "Project Genesis isn't just about creating stronger humans. It's about immortality. Your father understood that. He saw the potential in Lila's genetic makeup, and now, thanks to our research, we're closer than ever to achieving it." Ethan's stomach churned at the implications. His father hadn't just been complicit, he had actively sought to exploit his own granddaughter. The betrayal cut deeper than any wound. "You're insane," Ethan spat, his voice shaking with rage. "You've destroyed lives for this monstrosity." Victor's amusement faded, replaced by cold fury. "Insanity. No, Ethan. This is progress, and you're standing in its way." Before Ethan could respond, Sophie stepped forward, her voice ringing out with surprising strength. "You won't win," she declared, her eyes blazing with defiance. "People know about you now. They'll stop you." Victor Langston's gaze narrowed, his attention shifting to Sophie. "Ah, yes, the little runaway. You've caused quite a bit of trouble yourself." Sophie didn't flinch, even as the guards raised their weapons slightly. "You can't scare me anymore. I'm not afraid of you." Her bravery ignited something within Ethan, a spark of hope amidst the despair. If a child could stand up to these men, then so could he. Slowly, he reached into his pocket, his fingers brushing against the USB drive containing the evidence they had gathered. It was their only leverage, their only chance. "If you hurt her or anyone else, I'll make sure the world knows everything," Ethan warned, holding the drive up for emphasis. "Every experiment, every crime, everything." Victor Langston's smirk returned, though there was a flicker of unease in his eyes. "And how do you plan to do that, Ethan? You're trapped, outnumbered, outmatched." Ethan didn't answer. Instead, he glanced at Marcus, who gave a subtle nod. They had rehearsed this moment during their preparation, a desperate gamble, but one they had to take. In a flash, chaos erupted. Marcus lunged toward the nearest guard, disarming him with practiced precision. Daniel tackled another, using his knowledge of the base to exploit blind spots. Ethan grabbed Sophie and Lila, pulling them behind a stack of crates as gunfire echoed through the chamber. The sound was deafening, each bullet whizzing past like a deadly whisper. Ethan's heart pounded as he shielded the girls, his mind screaming at him to keep moving. They couldn't stay pinned down for long. "Stay close," he shouted over the noise, dragging them toward a narrow corridor leading deeper into the facility. Behind them, Marcus and Daniel fought valiantly, buying them precious seconds. As they ran, Ethan's thoughts raced. They had made it this far, but the battle was far from over. Victor Langston and his brother weren't going to let them escape, not without a fight. And somewhere in this labyrinth, answers awaited. The air in the corridor was thick with tension, as Victor Langston's words hung suspended. Reverberating through Ethan's mind: immortality, genetic experiments, his father's complicity. Each revelation struck like a hammer blow, shattering the fragile hope that had sustained him throughout this nightmare. But amidst the chaos, one truth became undeniable. Victor wasn't just after power, he was consumed by it, willing to sacrifice anything and anyone to achieve his vision. Ethan tightened his grip on Lila, who clung to him as if afraid he might vanish again. Sophie stood close, her small frame trembling but resolute. Marcus and Daniel were still engaged in a desperate struggle with the guards, their movements frantic yet calculated. Every second bought them precious time, but Ethan knew they couldn't hold out forever. Victor Calder, Ethan's brother, stepped forward, his expression conflicted. For the first time since their confrontation, Ethan saw cracks in his facade, flickers of doubt, guilt, perhaps even regret. "Ethan," Victor began, then, his voice unsteady. "You don't understand what we're trying to do here. This isn't about cruelty, it's about survival. About ensuring humanity has a future." "Survival?" Ethan spat, his voice laced with venom. "You call torturing children survival? Abducting them, experimenting on them, destroying families, that's your idea of progress?" Victor flinched, his gaze dropping momentarily before snapping back up. "It's not that simple. Father saw the potential in Project Genesis. He believed in it. And now we're so close to achieving something extraordinary." "Extraordinary?" Ethan roared, taking a step forward despite the weapons trained on them. "This isn't extraordinary, it's monstrous. You've betrayed everything we ever stood for. Everything I ever stood for." Victor hesitated, his jaw tightening. For a moment, Ethan thought he might actually listen, that some shred of the brother he once knew still existed beneath the layers of greed and ambition. But then Victor Langston intervened, his tone icy and commanding. "Enough of this," he snapped, gesturing to the guards. "Take them, all of them. We'll deal with them later." Before anyone could react, Sophie suddenly lunged forward, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "You won't win," she shouted, her eyes blazing with defiance. "Even if you kill us, people know the truth. They'll stop you." Victor Langston's smirk faltered, replaced by a flicker of unease. He turned to Sophie, studying her intently. "You," he murmured, his voice low and dangerous. "You're more than just a runaway, aren't you? You've been feeding information to someone outside." Sophie didn't respond, but her silence spoke volumes. Ethan's heart sank as realization dawned. She hadn't come to him purely out of desperation. She had been working with someone else all along, someone who had helped her escape Haven House and gather evidence against the Obsidian Circle. "Who are you working with?" Victor demanded, stepping closer to Sophie. When she remained silent, he grabbed her arm roughly, yanking her away from Ethan. "Tell me." "Leave her alone," Ethan shouted, lunging toward them. But before he could reach Sophie, two guards intercepted him, pinning him to the ground. Lila screamed, struggling against another guard who held her back. It doesn't matter who she's working with. Victor Langston sneered, tightening his grip on Sophie. They'll never get past our security. By the time they arrive, it'll be too late. Ethan's mind raced, searching for a way out. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and trapped. But as he locked eyes with Sophie, he saw something unexpected. A flicker of determination, a silent promise that she wasn't giving up. Then, without warning, the lights went out. The sudden darkness plunged the corridor into chaos. Shouts erupted from the guards, their confusion palpable. In the commotion, Ethan felt a sharp tug on his sleeve. It was Sophie, pulling him toward a narrow opening in the wall, a hidden passageway he hadn't noticed before. "This way," she whispered urgently, dragging him along. Lila followed closely, her hand clutching Ethan's shirt. Behind them, Marcus and Daniel fought to cover their retreat, their shouts blending with the sounds of scuffling and gunfire. The passageway was tight and claustrophobic, its walls slick with condensation. Ethan's lungs burned as they ran, his legs aching with every step. But he didn't dare slow down, not when freedom was within reach. Finally, they emerged into a large chamber filled with machinery and blinking control panels. At the center of the room stood a massive vault-like door, its surface etched with intricate designs. Sophie skidded to a halt, her breath coming in ragged gasps. "What is this place?" Ethan asked, his voice barely audible over the hum of the equipment. "This is where they keep the data," Sophie replied, her voice trembling but determined. "Everything, the experiments, the research, the names of everyone involved. If we destroy it, we can stop them." Ethan hesitated, glancing at Lila, who nodded weakly. He knew what they had to do. With shaking hands, he pulled out the USB drive containing the evidence they had gathered. Together, they worked quickly, uploading the files onto the system and triggering a self-destruct sequence. As alarms blared overhead, Victor Langston's voice echoed through the chamber, distorted by rage. "You fools! Do you have any idea what you've done?" Ethan ignored him, focusing instead on getting everyone to safety. They retraced their steps through the passageway, emerging into the cold night air just as explosions rocked the facility behind them. Flames licked at the sky, illuminating the mountainside in an eerie orange glow. For a moment, they simply stood there, watching as years of corruption and cruelty burned to ashes. Then slowly, Ethan turned to Sophie, his voice heavy with gratitude. "You saved us," he said softly. "All of us." Sophie shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "No," she whispered. "We saved each other." The flames from the burning facility lit up the night sky, casting long shadows across the mountainside. Ethan stood amidst the chaos, his chest heaving as he tried to process everything that had just happened. The weight of the revelations, the experiments, his father's betrayal, Victor's obsession with immortality, pressed down on him like an unyielding force. Yet despite the devastation, there was a glimmer of hope. Lila was safe in his arms, her small frame trembling but alive. Sophie stood beside them, her bravery unwavering even as tears streamed down her face. But the cost of their escape was undeniable. Marcus lay unconscious on the ground, blood seeping from a wound on his side. Daniel was nowhere to be seen, having disappeared into the chaos after helping them reach safety. And the facility they had destroyed? It wasn't just a lab, it was a tomb for countless lives lost to Victor Langston's twisted ambitions. Ethan knelt beside Marcus, pressing a makeshift bandage against his wound. "Stay with us," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "We made it this far, you can't give up now." Marcus groaned weakly, his eyelids fluttering open. "Did we stop them?" he rasped, his voice barely audible. "For now," Ethan replied, though the uncertainty lingered. Destroying the facility had dealt a significant blow to the Obsidian Circle. But Ethan knew better than to believe it was over. Organizations like this didn't crumble easily. They adapted, evolved, and struck back when least expected. As dawn broke over the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, Ethan gathered the group and led them away from the wreckage. They needed medical attention, rest, and time to regroup. But more than anything, They needed answers. Hours later, they found refuge in a remote cabin deep within the woods. It belonged to one of Marcus's contacts, a retired nurse named Clara who agreed to help without asking too many questions. She tended to Marcus's injuries while Ethan sat by the fire, holding Lila close. Sophie curled up on the couch, exhaustion finally overtaking her. For the first time since beginning this journey, Ethan allowed himself a moment to breathe. He studied Lila's face, memorizing every detail as if afraid she might disappear again. Her eyes were hollow, haunted by the horrors she had endured. But there was still a flicker of the bright, fearless girl she used to be. "Daddy," she whispered, breaking the silence. "I thought you'd forgotten about me." Ethan's heart shattered at her words. He pulled her closer, kissing the top of her head. "Never," he promised, his voice choked with emotion. "I'll never forget you. I'll spend the rest of my life making sure you're safe." Lila didn't respond, but she rested her head against his chest, finding solace in his presence. Ethan wished he could erase the pain she had suffered, shield her from the memories that would inevitably haunt her. But he knew some wounds ran too deep to heal completely. Sophie stirred on the couch, her eyes opening slowly. She looked at Ethan and Lila, then glanced toward Marcus, who was sleeping fitfully under Clara's care. "Do you think it's really over?" she asked softly. Ethan hesitated before answering. "I don't know," he admitted, "but we've taken away their power for now." "That's something." Sophie nodded, though her expression remained troubled. "What happens next?" "That depends on all of us," Ethan said, his tone firm yet gentle. "We've been through hell, but we survived. Now it's time to rebuild, to make sure no one else has to go through what we did." His words carried a sense of purpose, a determination to turn their suffering into something meaningful. But beneath the resolve lay scars that would take years to heal, if they ever did. The trauma of Haven House, the experiments, the betrayal by those closest to him. It was all etched into Ethan's soul, shaping him in ways he couldn't yet comprehend. Clara returned from checking on Marcus, her expression grim. "He'll live," she said, "but he needs proper medical care soon. We can't stay here forever." Ethan nodded, already formulating a plan. They would leave at first light, heading toward a safe house where they could regroup and decide their next move. The evidence they had gathered, the files, the USB drive, the destruction of Genesis Base, was enough to expose the Obsidian Circle. But exposing them wasn't enough. Ethan wanted justice. As the others drifted off to sleep, Ethan stayed awake, staring into the fire. His mind replayed the events of the past few days, each memory sharper and more painful than the last. He thought about his father, whose legacy had been built on lies and exploitation. He thought about Victor Calder, his own brother, who had betrayed him in the worst possible way. And he thought about Sophie, whose courage had saved them all. Despite everything, Ethan felt a strange sense of gratitude. The journey had been harrowing, but it had also shown him the strength of the human spirit, the resilience of children like Sophie and Lila, who refused to let the darkness consume them. It reminded him that even in the face of unimaginable evil, there was still light. When morning came, Ethan woke the others and prepared them for the journey ahead. As they stepped outside, the air was crisp and cool, carrying with it the promise of a new beginning. The road ahead would be difficult, fraught with challenges and uncertainties. But for the first time in years, Ethan felt hopeful. They climbed into the car, setting off toward the rising sun. Behind them, the smoldering ruins of Genesis Base served as a reminder of what they had sacrificed and what they had gained. Ahead of them lay the unknown, a future shaped by their choices. And for the first time, Ethan believed they could face it together. The confrontation with Victor Langston had been inevitable, a storm brewing on the horizon since the moment Ethan first uncovered the truth about Project Genesis. Now, as they stood face to face in the dimly lit ruins of Genesis Base, the air crackled with tension. The facility may have been destroyed, but Victor's presence loomed larger than ever, a shadow that refused to dissipate, even amidst the ashes of his empire. "You think this changes anything?" Victor sneered, his voice dripping with venom as he emerged from the smoke, flanked by a handful of loyal guards. His once immaculate suit was singed and torn, his face streaked with soot, but his arrogance remained intact. "You've only delayed the inevitable." Ethan tightened his grip on Lila, who clung to him like a lifeline. Sophie stood close, her small frame trembling but resolute. Marcus and Daniel were still recovering from their injuries, unable to fight, but Ethan knew this was his battle to finish. He stepped forward, placing himself between Victor and the others. "It's over," Ethan growled, his voice low and steady despite the chaos swirling around them. "Your experiments, your lies, they end here." Victor laughed, a cold, hollow sound that echoed through the wreckage. "End? Oh, Ethan, you truly don't understand, do you? This isn't just about me, this is bigger than any one person. Bigger than you, bigger than your precious daughter." Ethan's jaw clenched, his fists tightening at his sides. "Then explain it to me. Make me understand why you thought torturing children was worth it." Victor's smirk faltered for a moment, replaced by something darker, something almost vulnerable. "Because humanity is flawed, Ethan. Weak. Dying. What we're doing, what I'm doing, is giving the world a chance to evolve, to survive." "Survival?" Ethan spat, taking another step forward. "This isn't survival, it's madness. You've destroyed lives, ruined families, all in the name of some twisted vision of the future." Victor's expression hardened, his eyes narrowing into slits. "And what would you know about sacrifice, Ethan? You've spent your life hiding behind wealth and privilege, never understanding what it means to truly fight for something greater than yourself." The word struck a nerve, dredging up memories of his father's relentless demands, his brother's betrayal, and the years he'd wasted chasing success instead of cherishing the people who mattered most. But Ethan didn't let the guilt consume him. Instead, he channeled it into resolve. "I may not have fought before," Ethan admitted, his voice thick with emotion. "But I'm fighting now. For my daughter, for Sophie, for every child you've hurt." Victor's lips curled into a snarl. "Sentimental nonsense. You can't stop progress, Ethan. Even if you kill me, someone else will take my place. Someone stronger, smarter, better." "Maybe," Ethan said, his tone unwavering. "But not today." Before Victor could react, Ethan lunged forward, tackling him to the ground. The two men grappled fiercely, their movements fueled by years of pent-up anger and regret. Victor fought with the desperation of a man clinging to power, while Ethan battled with the ferocity of a father protecting his child. The guards hesitated, unsure whether to intervene. Sophie seized the opportunity, grabbing a piece of debris and hurling it at one of them, creating enough distraction for Marcus and Daniel to regain their footing. Chaos erupted once again, shouts and scuffles filling the air as the group fought to hold their ground. Finally, with a surge of adrenaline, Ethan pinned Victor to the ground, his hands gripping the man's collar. "It's over," he repeated, his voice trembling with rage. "You'll pay for what you've done." Victor stared up at him, his smug demeanor finally cracking. For the first time, Ethan saw fear in his eyes, a flicker of vulnerability beneath the mask of arrogance. "You won't win," Victor whispered, though his voice lacked conviction. "No matter what you do, the circle will continue." Ethan hesitated, the weight of Victor's words sinking in. Was he right? Could destroying Genesis Base really put an end to the Obsidian Circle, or was it merely a single thread in a much larger web? Before he could dwell on the thought, a loud rumble shook the ground beneath them. The remaining structure of the facility groaned ominously, its weakened foundation threatening to collapse entirely. Flames licked at the edges of the chamber, casting eerie shadows across the walls. "We need to go," Marcus shouted, limping toward the exit. "Now!" Reluctantly, Ethan released Victor, leaving him sprawled on the ground as the group fled the crumbling ruins. As they emerged into the daylight, the facility collapsed behind them in a fiery explosion, swallowing Victor Langston and his twisted ambitions in a blaze of destruction. But even as they watched the inferno burn, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end. Victor's words echoed in his mind, a haunting reminder that evil rarely died easily. The aftermath of the explosion left Ethan Calder standing amidst the smoldering ruins, his body trembling not from exhaustion, but from the weight of everything he had endured. The fire that consumed Genesis Base was more than just flames. It was a cleansing force, erasing the physical manifestation of Victor Langston's twisted ambitions. Yet, as the smoke cleared and the ashes settled, Ethan knew the scars would remain. Some wounds ran too deep to heal completely. Lila clung to him, her small frame shaking as she buried her face in his chest. She hadn't spoken much since their escape, her voice stolen by the horrors she had witnessed. Ethan held her tightly, wishing he could shield her from the memories that haunted her eyes. Sophie stood nearby, her gaze fixed on the burning wreckage, tears streaming silently down her cheeks. Despite her bravery, she was still just a child who had been forced to grow up far too quickly. Marcus leaned against a tree, his breathing labored as Clara tended to his injuries. Daniel sat on the ground, staring blankly at the flames, his expression unreadable. They were all broken in their own ways, each carrying the burden of what they had seen and done. But even in their shared pain, there was a sense of unity, a bond forged through survival. Ethan turned to Marcus, his voice heavy with gratitude. "Thank you," he said simply, knowing words could never fully convey how much Marcus's sacrifice meant. Without him, none of this would have been possible. Marcus managed a weak smile, though his eyes betrayed the toll the ordeal had taken. "We did what we had to do," he replied. "But it's not over yet." Ethan nodded, the reality sinking in. Destroying Genesis Base had dealt a significant blow to the Obsidian Circle. But organizations like this didn't crumble easily. Their roots ran deep, entangled in power structures and hidden agendas that spanned decades. Exposing them would require more than courage. It would demand resilience, strategy, and an unwavering commitment to justice. As dawn broke over the horizon, painting the sky in soft hues of orange and pink, Ethan gathered the group and prepared them for the journey ahead. They couldn't stay here. The authorities would eventually arrive, drawn by the destruction and chaos. And while the evidence they had gathered, the files, the USB drive, the testimonies of survivors, was enough to expose the truth, Ethan knew they needed to act quickly. "We'll head to a safe house," he announced, his tone firm but gentle. "From there, we'll decide our next move." No one argued. They trusted Ethan now, not just as a leader, but as someone who had proven himself willing to fight for them. As they climbed into the car, Ethan glanced back at the ruins one last time. The sight filled him with a mixture of sorrow and resolve. This wasn't just the end of a chapter. It was the beginning of a new fight. Hours later, they arrived at a secluded cabin nestled deep within the woods. It belonged to Clara, who insisted they stay until they were ready to face the world again. Inside, the air was warm and inviting, a stark contrast to the cold, sterile environment of Genesis Base. For the first time in days, they felt safe, or as close to safe as they could be. Clara busied herself preparing food and tending to Marcus's injuries, while Ethan sat by the fire with Lila and Sophie. He watched them quietly, marveling at their strength despite everything they had endured. Lila finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Will they come after us again?" she asked, her wide eyes searching his for reassurance. Ethan hesitated before answering. Honesty was important, but so was hope. "I don't know," he admitted. "But if they do, we'll face them together, I promise." Sophie nodded, her expression resolute. "We're stronger than they think." Her words struck a chord deep within Ethan. These children weren't just victims, they were survivors. Their courage reminded him why he had fought so hard, why he had risked everything. And it gave him the strength to keep going, even when the road ahead seemed uncertain. As night fell, Ethan stepped outside, gazing up at the stars scattered across the sky. The silence was peaceful, a welcome reprieve from the chaos that had consumed his life. He thought about his father, whose legacy had been built on lies and exploitation. He thought about Victor Calder, his own brother, who had betrayed him in the worst possible way, and he thought about the countless lives destroyed by the Obsidian Circle. But most of all, he thought about redemption. Not just for himself, but for everyone affected by the atrocities committed in the name of progress. He couldn't undo the past, but he could shape the future. He owed it to Lila, to Sophie, to Marcus, to everyone who had suffered because of his family's sins. When he returned inside, the others were asleep, their breathing steady and calm. Ethan sat by the fire, allowing himself a moment of reflection. The journey had been harrowing, but it had also shown him the resilience of the human spirit, the ability to rise above even the darkest circumstances. For the first time in years, Ethan believed in hope. Not the naive kind, but the kind born from struggle and perseverance. It wasn't perfect, and it certainly wasn't easy. But it was real, and sometimes that was enough. The safe house was quiet, the kind of silence that felt heavy with unspoken truths. Ethan sat at a small wooden table, the evidence they had gathered spread out before him like pieces of a puzzle finally coming together. Lila and Sophie were asleep in the next room, their breathing soft and steady, a stark contrast to the storm raging inside Ethan's mind. He stared at the photographs, documents, and notes, each one a fragment of the nightmare he had lived through. But it wasn't until he picked up the USB drive containing the files from Genesis Base that everything clicked into place. With trembling hands, he inserted it into an old laptop Clara had provided, his heart pounding as the screen flickered to life. What he found chilled him to the bone. The files revealed not only the extent of Victor Langston's experiments, but also the identities of those who had funded and supported Project Genesis. Names scrolled across the screen. Politicians, corporate executives, even members of his own family. His father's signature appeared on several documents, authorizing payments and resources for the project. It was undeniable proof of Richard Calder's complicity, a betrayal so profound it left Ethan reeling. But there was more. Buried within the data was a video file labeled Genesis Protocol. Ethan hesitated before clicking play, unsure if he was ready for what it might reveal. The footage showed Victor Langston addressing a group of shadowy figures seated around a conference table. Their faces were obscured, but their voices carried authority and power. "This is just the beginning," Victor said, his tone triumphant. "With the success of Project Genesis, we can rewrite the rules of humanity itself. Disease, aging, death, they will all become relics of the past." One of the figures leaned forward, their voice distorted but unmistakably familiar. "And the collateral damage? The children? They are sacrifices necessary for progress," Victor replied without hesitation. "Their genetic material holds the key to unlocking immortality. Once we perfect the process, their suffering will be justified." Ethan's blood ran cold. He recognized the voice. It belonged to his brother, Victor Calder. The realization hit him like a freight train, shattering any lingering hope that his brother might have been coerced or manipulated. Victor had been a willing participant, fully aware of the atrocities committed in the name of science. Tears streamed down Ethan's face as he watched the rest of the video, each frame confirming the depth of the corruption and greed that had driven the Obsidian Circle. When the footage ended, he sat in stunned silence, the weight of the truth pressing down on him. Marcus entered the room moments later, his movements slow and deliberate. "You okay?" he asked, though his expression suggested he already knew the answer. Ethan shook his head, unable to speak. Instead, he turned the laptop toward Marcus, letting the evidence speak for itself. As Marcus reviewed the files, his jaw tightened, his eyes darkening with anger and disbelief. This changes everything," Marcus murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. "Eh? If we release this, it'll bring down everyone involved, the entire network." "That's the plan," Ethan said, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside him. "We expose them. All of them." Marcus hesitated, then nodded. "It won't be easy. They'll fight back harder than ever. And some people won't survive the fallout." "I know," Ethan replied, his gaze fixed on the screen. "But we don't have a choice. If we don't do this, no one will." The next morning, Ethan gathered the group and explained their final move. Using the evidence they had collected, they would leak the information to trusted journalists and activists capable of amplifying the message. It was a risky strategy, one that could put them all in danger, but it was the only way to ensure justice. As they prepared to leave the safe house, Ethan noticed Sophie standing by the window, her expression thoughtful. "What's wrong?" he asked, kneeling beside her. "I'm scared," she admitted, her voice trembling. "What if they come after us again?" Ethan placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "They might," he said honestly, "but we've faced worse. And this time, we're not alone. The world will know the truth, and that means we have allies everywhere." Sophie nodded, though her eyes still reflected uncertainty. Ethan understood. Fear was natural, especially after everything she had endured. But he also saw something else in her gaze, a spark of hope, however faint. When they arrived at a secure location in the city, Ethan uploaded the files to multiple platforms, ensuring they couldn't be erased or suppressed. Within hours, the story broke, spreading like wildfire across news outlets and social media. The public outcry was immediate and overwhelming, demanding accountability and justice for the victims of the Obsidian Circle. As the days passed, arrests were made, investigations launched, and lives forever changed. For the first time in years, Ethan allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, they had truly made a difference. But the scars remained. Some wounds, he realized, would never fully heal. And yet, amidst the pain, there was redemption. The days that followed the exposure of the Obsidian Circle were a blur of media coverage, legal proceedings, and public outrage. The world had been shaken to its core by the revelations, and the demand for justice was overwhelming. Arrests were made at every level, from low-ranking operatives to high-profile figures whose names Ethan had once revered. Among them was Victor Calder, his own brother, who now faced charges that would likely keep him behind bars for the rest of his life. Ethan watched the news reports with a mixture of relief and sorrow. Justice was being served, but it came at a cost he hadn't fully anticipated. The betrayal cut deeper than any wound, a fracture in his family that could never be repaired. Yet amidst the pain, there was clarity. For years, he had carried the weight of his father's legacy, striving to live up to impossible standards while ignoring the cracks beneath the surface. Now, he understood that true strength wasn't about perfection, it was about accountability. Lila began to heal slowly, her laughter returning in small bursts that reminded Ethan of the daughter she used to be. Sophie, too, found solace in their makeshift family, her resilience inspiring everyone around her. Together, they formed a bond stronger than blood, a testament to survival and hope. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting golden light across the grounds of Ethan's estate, he received an unexpected letter. It was from Victor Calder, written during his final days before sentencing. The envelope trembled in Ethan's hands as he opened it, unsure of what to expect. Inside was a single sheet of paper, the handwriting shaky but deliberate. "Ethan, I don't expect forgiveness for myself or for the things I've done, but I want you to know that I acted out of fear, not malice. Father's shadow loomed over me my entire life, and I thought this was the only way to step out from under it. I was wrong. You've always been the better man, even when I refused to see it. Take care of Lila, and take care of yourself. Maybe one day we can both find peace. Victor." Tears welled in Ethan's eyes as he read the words. They didn't excuse Victor's actions, but they offered a glimpse into the pain that had driven him. For the first time, Ethan felt a flicker of empathy, not absolution, but understanding. He folded the letter carefully and placed it in a drawer, vowing to revisit it when the time was right. Then, he stepped outside, where Lila and Sophie played in the garden, their laughter echoing through the air. Marcus stood nearby, leaning on a cane but smiling faintly as he watched them. "You did good, kid," Marcus said, nodding toward the girls. "They're gonna be okay." Ethan nodded, though his throat tightened with emotion. "Yeah," he murmured. "They are." As the sun set, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, Ethan realized something profound. This journey hadn't just been about finding Lila or exposing the truth. It had been about redemption. Redemption for himself, for his family, and for everyone affected by the sins of the past. He knelt beside Lila and Sophie, pulling them into a tight embrace. "No matter what happens," he said softly, "we'll always have each other." Sophie smiled, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "We're a team, right?" "Always," Ethan replied, his voice steady despite the emotion swirling within him. In that moment, surrounded by the people he loved most, Ethan felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. The scars remained, some visible, others hidden, but they no longer defined him. Instead, they served as reminders of how far he had come and how much he still had to give. Later that night, as Ethan sat alone in his study, he picked up a photograph of his father. For so long, Richard Calder's image had represented everything Ethan despised about his upbringing: the pressure, the expectations, the lies. But now, he saw something else, a flawed man who had tried and failed to leave a legacy worth remembering. Ethan placed the photograph back on the shelf, turning instead to a blank canvas propped against the wall. He picked up a brush and began to paint, channeling his emotions into strokes of color and light. By morning, the canvas bore an image of two figures standing side by side, one tall and strong, the other small but determined. Together, they faced a rising sun, symbolizing hope, resilience, and renewal. It was a new beginning, not just for Ethan, but for all of them. Months later, Ethan stood before a crowd gathered at the site where Genesis Base once stood. In its place was a memorial dedicated to the victims of the Obsidian Circle, their names etched into stone as a reminder of the lives lost and the lessons learned. Sophie and Lila stood beside him, holding his hands tightly as he addressed the crowd. "This isn't just a monument," Ethan said, his voice steady and clear. "It's a promise to fight for a future where no child has to endure what these brave souls suffered. Their stories will guide us, their courage will inspire us, and their memory will live on in everything we do." As the crowd applauded, Ethan turned to Sophie and Lila, his heart swelling with gratitude. They had survived unimaginable horrors, yet they chose to believe in a better tomorrow. And in doing so, they had taught him the true meaning of hope. Together they walked away from the memorial, leaving behind the shadows of the past and stepping boldly into the light.